The fruit buyer called the apples hog mash. Evelyn Harrow paid him for 3 sacks anyway. 6 weeks later, the first 30 jars bought back her dead husband's land note, and the man who had called the fruit worthless had to sign his name beneath the word paid. The morning after the fire, Briar Hollow smelled of wet ash and split apples. The blaze had started in the grass west of the Keene orchard. A hard wind drove it through the lower rows before a night rain finally beat it down. The trees survived. Most of the fruit did not. Apples lay in blackened grass, their skins blistered on one side, their flesh bruised where they had fallen. Men moved through the rows with rakes and feed baskets, collecting what they could for hogs. Evelyn stood near the loading shed with a dozen farmers and watched Gideon Rusk cut open an apple with his pocket knife. Rusk owned the general store, the freight contracts, and most of the private notes in the valley. He was not loud. He did not need to be. He spoke as if the numbers had already agreed with him before anyone else arrived. He looked at the browned edge of the apple. 3 cents a bushel, he said, for mash. More than it deserves. Jonas Keene, who'd planted the orchard with his brothers 22 years earlier, stared at the mud around his boots. 3 cents would not pay the men who gathered it, but everyone knew what happened to damaged fruit when Rusk was the only buyer, with wagons headed out of the valley. It became worth whatever he said. Evelyn stepped past the others and picked up an apple. One side was scorched. The other still held a deep red shine beneath the soot. She turned it in her hand and pressed her thumb against the sound flesh. Firm, heavy, sweet-smelling beneath the smoke. A burn mark, her mother used to say, showed where the heat had been. It did not always show how far the heat had gone. "How much for a sack?" Evelyn asked. Rusk looked at her as though he had forgotten she was standing there. "To buy?" "To buy." His eyes went from the apple to her coat, then to the thin mule waiting beside her wagon. 18 cents, he said, given the condition. 18 cents was nearly a week of flour. Evelyn had $12.40 left in a tin behind the stove. She also owed Gideon Rusk $47 on the Harrow homestead, plus interest. The sensible answer was no. "I'll take 3 sacks, she said. Someone behind her laughed once, then swallowed it. Rusk smiled. 3 sacks, he said. I'll have them loaded. Evelyn drove home with the wagons smelling of smoke and cider. Her house stood on 60 acres at the north edge of Briar Hollow, where the soil thinned towards stone and the wind found every crack in the boards. Her husband, Caleb, had chosen the parcel because of the spring beneath the hill. He had died 2 winters earlier when a lung fever passed through the valley. He left behind a half-finished smokehouse, a broken plow, and a land note held by Gideon Rusk. Evelyn had spent 2 years learning which losses could be repaired and which ones only changed shape. She carried the first sack into the kitchen and poured the apples across the table. Soot darkened the cloth. Some fruit collapsed beneath her fingers. Some had gone bitter from heat, but not all. She cut one open. The scorched half was ruined. The center was sound. The unburned flesh tasted sharp, sweet, and faintly smoky. Not enough smoke to spoil it, enough to make it different. Evelyn stood with the knife in one hand and the apple in the other. Then she pulled her mother's iron recipe box from the top shelf. Inside were cards stained with grease, cider, and years of handling. Her mother, Ada Vale, had cooked in a boarding house near the rail line. She measured nothing casually. She wrote temperatures beside weather notes. She recorded which apples broke down smooth and which stayed grainy. On one card, beneath a recipe for kettle butter, she had written, "A mark tells you where the damage stopped. Cut until the knife finds clean flesh. Trust what remains." Evelyn read the line twice. Then she built up the fire. She worked until midnight. Every apple had to be judged separately. Scorched flesh went into one bucket. Sound flesh went into the copper kettle. Fruit that smelled bitter was discarded. Fruit that held sweetness stayed. By dawn, her hands were brown with juice and soot. The first batch was too thin. The second caught at the bottom and tasted of iron. The third turned dark and smooth beneath the spoon, thick enough that a line drawn through it held for 3 full breaths before closing. She added cider vinegar, brown sugar, cinnamon, and a small scrape of dried ginger she had been saving since Christmas. The flavor deepened. Smoke, apple, spice. Not a dessert. Something steadier. Something that tasted like warmth after bad weather. She poured it into 6 jars, sealed them with paraffin, and set them on the window ledge. At sunrise, 5 seals held. 1 failed. Evelyn looked at the 5 good jars glowing dark amber in the cold light. "Ember apple butter," she said aloud. The name stayed. By the 4th day, she had run out of jars. That was when Nell Crow knocked on her door. Nell was 13, narrow-shouldered and serious. She slept in the loft above the livery because her father worked cattle drives and returned only when work brought him back. The town called the arrangement temporary. It had been temporary for 3 years. "I heard you need glass," Nell said. "Who told you?" "Mrs. Reed." Dorcas Reed lived near the South Spring and knew everything worth knowing in Briar Hollow. She had delivered half the children in the valley and buried more people than the church deacon. Her pantry shelves held jars in military rows. Nell held up a flour sack. "I found 9 at the old schoolhouse, thick glass, no cracks." Evelyn examined the jars. "Where?" "Under the back steps. They were packed in straw." "You ask before taking them?" "The school trustee said anything under there belonged to rats." Evelyn almost smiled. "What do you want for them?" Nell looked past her into the kitchen. "Work. I cannot pay much." "You can pay later." That answer made Evelyn look at her more carefully. Nell did not look desperate. She looked certain. "Wash your hands," Evelyn said. "Then sort the red apples from the yellow. If the flesh smells bitter, it goes out. If the bruise reaches the core, it goes out. Do not guess." Nell washed her hands and did not ask another question. By evening, she could judge a damaged apple nearly as well as Evelyn could. She noticed that the smoke had touched the fruit unevenly. Apples from the upper rows held only surface blistering. The ones from the creek side had absorbed bitterness all the way through. "You can smell the difference near the stem," Nell said. Evelyn tested 3. The girl was right. After that, Nell sorted by smell before the knife ever touched the skin. The work moved faster. Dorcas Reed arrived the next morning carrying 21 jars in 2 baskets. She was 64, tall and dark-skinned, with silver threaded through her hair and a wool coat patched so neatly the repairs looked deliberate. She set the baskets down. "I heard you bought Rusk's hog mash." I bought Keen's apples from Rusk. That is a longer sentence for the same foolish act. Evelyn waited. Dorcas looked toward the stove. Let me taste it. Evelyn opened one of the first jars and handed her a spoon. Dorcas tasted once, then again. She looked at the jar against the light. Not jam, she said. No. Not ordinary apple butter either. No. Dorcas set down the spoon. My mother cooked over cane fires in Louisiana. She used to say heat leaves two things behind: what it destroys and what it reveals. She pushed the baskets closer. These jars are alone. I will return them. I know. Dorcas looked at Nell, then at the apples, then back at Evelyn. Rusk will come when he smells money. He already smells it. No. Right now he smells curiosity. Money makes men like him walk faster. She left without another word. For the next 3 weeks, the kitchen became a small factory. Nell arrived before breakfast. Evelyn cut, Nell sorted. They cooked by color, then by drag against the spoon, then by the way the surface bubbles slowed when the batch thickened. 42 jars became 68. 68 became 91. They found more glass in the cellar of the abandoned Price house, wrapped in old newspaper and mouse-chewed cloth. Dorcas traded 10 jars for 2 cords of split wood from her nephew. Jonas Keen sent another sack of apples without charge after learning what Evelyn was making. I sold the crop already, he said, but those were on the north row. Rusk's men missed them. Evelyn paid him anyway. 6 cents. Not much. Twice what Rusk had offered. Keen took the money and closed his hand around it, as if the number mattered less than the fact that she had named one herself. At 112 jars, Gideon Rusk came to the house. He wore his store coat and carried his hat at his side. Evelyn met him on the porch. Behind her, the kitchen smelled of apples and wood smoke. Rusk glanced past her at the shelves. His eyes counted quickly. You have made something useful, he said. I have. I can move it. I know you can. He smiled slightly. 55 cents a jar for the lot, cash against your note. You would clear the debt before snow. Evelyn had expected an offer. She had not expected the insult to arrive dressed so neatly. 55 cents a jar would put $61 in his hands. He could erase the note, take the entire stock, and sell each jar for more than twice that in rail towns. Her work would disappear into his ledger. His profit would become proof that only he had known what to do with it. What would you charge in ironwood? She asked. That depends on transport. How much? Markets change. So does your answer. The pleasantness thinned from his face. You are a good cook, Mrs. Harrow. That is not the same as being a merchant. No, Evelyn said, but I am learning the difference. He placed his hat on his head. Think quickly. Winter does not reward pride. After he left, Evelyn stood in the doorway until the cold forced her inside. She did the arithmetic at the kitchen table. Sugar, spice, paraffin, wood, glass that had to be replaced. 3 weeks of labor. 55 cents was not a price. It was a lid, and Rusk expected her to seal herself beneath it. Nell sat across from her and studied the figures upside down. The dining cars buy preserves, she said. Evelyn looked up. What dining cars? The North Continental. They stop in Ironwood twice a week. Mr. Bale at the livery says the kitchen car buys local honey and pickles when the regular shipments run late. Ironwood was 30 miles east. A long ride in November. A bigger market. A place where Gideon Rusk's store did not control the door. Do you know who buys? No. That is not much of a plan. Nell shrugged. It is more plan than selling to Rusk. The next morning, Evelyn packed 8 jars into straw and left before dawn. Ironwood rose around the rail line in brick, smoke, and noise. The depot roof was black with coal soot. Porters moved trunks beneath clouds of steam. A dining car stood on a siding, brass trim dull beneath the winter sky. Evelyn asked 3 men before anyone directed her to the commissary. The buyer was a woman named Margaret Sloane, broad-shouldered, gray-eyed, and too busy to be polite. "You have 1 minute," Sloane said. Evelyn handed her a jar. Ember apple butter, made from fire-marked Briar Hollow apples. Taste it before I explain it. Sloane looked at her, then at the jar. She opened it. The seal broke clean. She tasted. Her expression did not change, but she took a second spoonful. What is in it? Apple, brown sugar, cider vinegar, cinnamon, ginger, and smoke that never reached the core. Sloane held the spoon still. How many? 112 finished. More if the last sound fruit holds. Uniform? Not identical. Honest. The darker batches carry more smoke. The lighter ones are sharper. That makes service difficult. It makes the menu truthful. Sloane looked at her again, this time longer. $1.20 per jar for 24 jars, she said. Delivered here. If passengers ask for it, I take more. Evelyn had rehearsed every answer except the one she needed now. 135. 125. 130. Sloane closed the jar. 130. 24 jars. Friday. Done. On the road home, Evelyn did the numbers once, then again. 24 jars would bring $31.20. 48 more at the same price would clear the note by themselves. For the first time in 2 years, the debt looked smaller than the work in front of her. But Briar Hollow had its own winter coming. The fire had spared most of the trees, but the rain that stopped it brought a fungus through the lower orchards. Within 10 days, black rot spread across Keene's storage crop, and then into 2 neighboring cellars. Barrels were opened and dumped. Good winter fruit vanished by the wagon load. By late November, Ember apple butter was not simply unusual. It was most of the preserved apple in the valley. Evelyn stood before 126 jars and understood the cruelty of the opportunity. She could sell every jar to the railroad commissary. She could clear the note, repair the roof, buy seed, and enter spring with money left. No one could call that wrong. But families who had expected 6 barrels of apples now had none. Dorcas Reed's sister had 4 grandchildren in her house. Jonas Keene had lost nearly the entire season. The Crow girl ate most of her meals at the livery. Scarcity had made Evelyn's work valuable. Scarcity had also made her neighbors vulnerable. That night, Nell found her at the table with 2 columns of figures. Ironwood and Briar Hollow, Nell said. Yes. How many for each? I do not know. You do. Evelyn looked at her. Nell pointed to the sheet. You keep writing the same numbers. Evelyn had divided the jars 4 times. 36 for ironwood, 75 for town. 15 held back for winter, replacements, and wages. The split left less profit than selling everything east. It also left enough. Enough to pay Rusk, enough to buy spring seed, enough to keep food in her own house. I keep asking what the jars are worth, Evelyn said. Nell waited. That is the wrong question. What is the right one? Evelyn looked at the shelves. What they are for. Gideon Rusk arrived 2 days later with no hat in his hands. He stood squarely on the porch. I heard about ironwood. I assumed you would. The Harrow note gives me first refusal on commercial produce sold from the property. Raw produce grown on the property. The apples were processed here. The apples were grown at Keene's orchard and purchased by me after you classified them as feed waste. Rusk's jaw tightened. I can call the note. You can demand payment according to its terms. I can demand all of it by market Saturday. Evelyn felt fear move through her, not panic, not weakness, a clean, cold understanding of the risk. Then I will pay all of it on market Saturday. Rusk's eyes went past her to the shelves. He had expected delay. He had expected apology. He had expected the note to make her smaller. All of it? He asked. Principal and lawful interest. The word lawful stopped him for half a breath. Evelyn had spent the previous night reading the note beside a lamp. The interest language was clumsy. Rusk's private ledger had charged compounding fees the paper itself did not authorize. She now knew the exact number she owed. $54.80, not the 63 he had implied. I will bring my copy, she said. You bring yours. He left without another threat. After the wagon disappeared, Evelyn closed the door and leaned against it. Her hands were shaking. Nell saw. You all right? No, Evelyn said. But I will be. That answer satisfied them both. The Saturday market opened under a hard white sky. Evelyn drove into Briar Hollow with 75 jars packed upright in straw. Nell sat beside her in a coat Dorcas had altered to fit. Evelyn had spent the previous night reading the note beside a lamp. The interest language was clumsy. Rusk's private ledger had charged compounding fees the paper itself did not authorize. She now knew the exact number she owed. $54.80, not the 63 he had implied. I will bring my copy, she said. You bring yours. He left without another threat. After the wagon disappeared, Evelyn closed the door and leaned against it. Her hands were shaking. Nell saw. You all right? No, Evelyn said. But I will be. That answer satisfied them both. The Saturday market opened under a hard white sky. Evelyn drove into Briar Hollow with 75 jars packed upright in straw. Nell sat beside her in a coat Dorcas had altered to fit. People were already waiting between the feed barn and Rusk's store. Word had traveled faster than Evelyn expected. The fire, the rot, the railroad sale, Rusk's demand. Small towns did not need newspapers when worry had enough mouths. Evelyn stopped her wagon in the center of the market ground. She pulled back the canvas. The jars caught the weak winter sun. dark amber, copper, mahogany at the edges. The fruit buyer had called the apples hog mash. Now the whole valley stood looking at what remained after someone had cut away the lie. Evelyn climbed onto the wagon step. "I have 75 jars for Briar Hollow," she said. 70 cents each, 2 per household until noon. The number moved through the crowd. It was not cheap. It was not city price. It was a number built to carry both sides of the truth. Her labor mattered. Their winter mattered. Jonas Keene stepped forward first. He held out $1.40. "2," he said. Evelyn handed them down. Keene turned 1 jar in his hand. "My apples," he said quietly. "Your sound fruit," Evelyn answered. Dorcas bought 2. The livery owner bought 2. A woman from the South Road bought 1 and asked whether Evelyn would hold another until egg money came in. Evelyn wrote her name on a scrap of paper and placed 1 jar beneath the wagon seat. No charity, no public display. A simple debt between women. The line grew. Nell handled the jars while Evelyn made change. They worked in the same rhythm they had found in the kitchen. Lift, pass, count, mark. By 11, 43 jars were gone. That was when Gideon Rusk crossed the market ground. Conversation thinned around him. He stopped beside the wagon. "You have made this personal," he said. Evelyn looked at the people standing close enough to hear. "No. Debt is personal. Price is public." "You told people I underpaid Keene." "You paid him 3 cents for fruit you said was worthless, then offered me 55 cents for work you intended to sell higher. Those are numbers, Mr. Rusk. They do not become insults because they are spoken aloud." His face reddened. "You owe your place to my patience." Evelyn reached into her coat and removed a folded paper. "No. I owe you $54.80. She handed him her calculation. 47 principal. $7.80 simple interest under Clause 4. Your ledger adds 2 compounding service charges not written into the note. The crowd was silent now. Rusk did not take the paper. "You are not a lawyer." "No. I am the person who signed it. And I finally read it like my house depended on every word." Something shifted in the faces around them. Not a cheer, not triumph. Recognition. The dangerous kind. The kind that makes people remember their own papers waiting in drawers. Rusk looked at the remaining jars, then at the line, then at his store. His power had not disappeared, but for the first time, everyone could see the edge of it. "I will expect payment by close of market," he said. "You will have it." He walked away. The line began moving again. By noon, Evelyn had 11 jars left. She closed the sale. A few people protested. She shook her head. 11 are not for the market. 3 went to Dorcas in exchange for the jars she had loaned. 2 went to Jonas Keene for the final sack of fruit. 2 went to the woman waiting on egg money, marked paid in advance for spring labor. 2 went to Nell. The last 2 stayed with Evelyn. Nell held her jars against her chest. "You said wages later." "I did." "These are not wages?" "No, these are winter." Nell considered that. "Then wages later." Wages later. Evelyn counted the cash box. $57.10. Enough. She crossed the market ground and entered Rusk's store. He had the note waiting. She counted out $54.80 on the counter. He counted it again. Then he wrote across the paper, "Paid in full." He signed beneath it. The scrape of his pen sounded louder than it should have. Evelyn took the note. It weighed less than 1 jar. She folded it and placed it inside her coat beside her mother's recipe card. Outside, Nell waited on the wagon. "Done?" she asked. "Done." They drove home beneath a sky the color of iron. The empty straw shifted softly behind them. Evelyn expected relief to feel larger. Instead, it felt quiet, like a room after a machine stops, like realizing the sound that had ruled your life was no longer there. The following Friday, she delivered 36 jars to Margaret Sloane at the Ironwood Commissary. Sloane paid $46.80. "The first batch sold in 4 days," she said. Passengers asked why it tasted smoky. "What did you tell them?" "That the orchard burned and the cook knew where to cut." Evelyn looked at her. "That is nearly true. It is true enough for a menu." "No," Evelyn said. "Tell them the orchard did not burn. The grass did. The fruit fell. We saved what the heat did not take." Sloane studied her, then nodded. "I will change the card." That mattered more than Evelyn expected, not because the story made the jars more valuable, because the truth did. By spring, Ember apple butter had become a business small enough to fit inside Evelyn's kitchen and large enough to require a ledger. Jonas Keene agreed to sell her windfall fruit at 9 cents a bushel and sound surplus at 14. 2 other orchard families asked for the same arrangement. Dorcas negotiated payment in cash, jars, and first choice of the cinnamon shipment. Nell returned every morning at 7. This time, Evelyn paid her by the day. The first week, Nell counted the coins 3 times. Not because she doubted the amount, because she was learning what it felt like when labor arrived at the end of a number instead of disappearing inside someone else's kindness. Gideon Rusk did not lose his store. Men like him rarely vanished because one woman read one note. But people began reading their own. They asked why service charges appeared in ledgers but not contracts. They compared freight rates. Keene started sending 2 wagons east with a cooperative load instead of selling every crop through Rusk. The change was not dramatic enough for a legend. It was real enough for a valley. Evelyn used part of the winter profit to finish the smokehouse Caleb had started. The north wall leaned. 2 roof boards had warped. 1 hinge had rusted in place. Nell wanted to tear it down and rebuild. Evelyn refused. "Why keep the bad boards?" Nell asked. "Because they still hold. That is not the same as being good." "No," Evelyn said. "But it is the beginning of knowing what to replace." They worked through March. Dorcas brought nails. Keene sent cedar planks. Evelyn reset the hinge and straightened the wall. When the smokehouse stood square, she placed the first 2 copper kettles inside and hung her mother's iron recipe box above the work table. That summer, the valley escaped fire. The apples came in clean. Evelyn worried the new batch would lose the thing that had made Ember different. She cooked 1 kettle and tasted it. Sweet, bright, ordinary. Nell tasted it too. "Good," she said, "but not Ember." "No." Evelyn looked at the clean fruit on the table. For one dangerous moment, she wished for the mark. Then she understood the mistake. The fire had never been the gift. Attention was. She reduced the sugar, added tart crab apples from the north fence, toasted the cinnamon before grinding it, let the kettle darken slowly instead of forcing it with more heat. The flavor returned, not identical, not pretending to be born from disaster, but deep enough to stand beside the first season honestly. She labeled it North Kettle Apple Butter. Ember remained what it had always been. One season, one truth. One batch made from fruit everyone had stopped seeing clearly. Years later, people in Briar Hollow remembered the market morning when Evelyn Harrow paid Gideon Rusk in front of his own store. But that was not the moment that changed her life. The change happened earlier. It happened in the burned grass, when she lifted one fallen apple and turned it toward the unmarked side. It happened when she stopped asking what the damage looked like and started asking where it ended. The fire had marked the fruit. It had not named its value.